You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom and welcome to SLA Insights. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and we're continuing to discuss reading and reading fluency and how to develop that. For the last several episodes, I've been talking about some of the mental processes involved in reading, a lot of the theoretical issues that dealing with working memory and limitations and how all that works. Now I want to start with some practical reading activities and strategies. And the goal through these strategies is reading fluency in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and so on. Now, for the development of fluency, targeted repetition really is the key. Lots of exposure, but carefully crafted exposure, not just general exposure to the language, but targeted, looking at specific areas. Specific vocabulary, specific grammatical items, specific constructions, again, targeted repetition so that the student gets exposure and practice with these various aspects of the language. I have a great quote from Grabe, who says, implicit learning is gradual, initially very fragile, and strongly based in repetition of form and process over a long period of time. So you need to be patient. That's kind of the takeaway here, that it takes a long time to develop reading fluency, and it takes a lot of repetition. And so the activity I'm going to introduce for today is extensive reading. And I've mentioned this before, specifically when I was talking about input and input practice and getting a lot of comprehensible input. And so here I want to talk a little bit more in detail about how you might set up a program of extensive reading for your classroom. But I want to start with just a basic definition and kind of a rationale for why you might be doing extensive reading. Because reading skills develop incrementally, back to that quote from Grabe, an increase in practice and exposure leads into the language will result in further growth, development, automaticity in those reading skills. However, there's a caveat. You can't just throw a bunch of reading at your students and expect them to pick it up. Again, if we go back to input, we're talking comprehensible input that the learners can understand for the most part. So the reading materials have to be at or below the learner's current level of proficiency, so that slow readers can shift from analytical word-by-word identification to more automatic word recognition as they go. So you want to encourage the students to read large quantities of text, easy reading materials for them to promote fluency and ultimately comprehension. So how are we going to do it? What's the strategy? Well, here's what I would recommend. Feel free to take it and add your own if you have some suggestions on how you might develop this. But you want to build up a significant number of texts, simple but interesting reading materials. And this is hard right now. In Latin, you probably have more options than Hebrew or Greek. If you do a quick Google search for Latin reading materials, simplified stories in Latin, you should come up with a decent amount. Hebrew and Greek, we're getting more. There's more available, but still rather limited. A few sources I could point you to would be Glossa House publishers have a lot of simplified texts in Hebrew and Greek. And Sawyer Moranville of Lingua Deo Gloria Ministries is also producing a lot of simplified readers for Greek and Hebrew. So do what you can. If you can't find them, try creating them. And I've talked in other episodes about how you might go about creating either a simplified text or a diglot weave. something like that to simplify the text, so you can create your own original simplified text. But the goal is to get a really substantial collection of interesting and accessible reading materials at various levels. So students from beginner up to intermediate and advanced will have something that they can access for them at that level. Then, once you've started collecting, what you want to do is analyze the grammar and especially the vocabulary of each reading item that you have, each story, and determine its level. So, the the benchmark here, and I've said this before in other episodes, the benchmark is 95 to 98% of the running words in the text the student needs to understand. If their vocabulary is at such a level that they can understand 95 to 98% of the words in that text, then that's that's their text. Um, so if it's, for example, if a student has completed lesson 10 in Greek and knows enough vocabulary and grammar to understand at least 95 to 98% of the words in that particular text, whatever story it is you have for them, but a student in lesson 9 could not reach that 95 to 98% threshold, then the reading material needs to be considered and labeled as something that students from lesson 10 on could read. And so you want to label that item accordingly. So say your textbook lesson 10 introduces certain vocabulary, the student can read that particular story at 95 to 98% coverage, then label it as a lesson 10 or above story. Now, ideally, you want to have enough materials so that students at all the various levels are going to be able to have some variety and choices. Now, again, we're limited. There's more coming out all the time, but do what you can, as much as you can in each of these levels. So that's getting things ready. And then once you have those reading materials, and of course, over time, you're going to continue to build as you're able, but start where you can, and then begin to incorporate these stories and encouraging extensive reading into your regular instruction. A couple options you have here. One is make it part of the course grade. You can measure extensive reading in time on tasks. For example, you expect the students to read 10 or 20 minutes a day, 5 days a week, or something like that. Or maybe the number of pages read. They have to read at least 10 pages per week or something like that. Or word count. They need to read at least, 600 Hebrew words each week. Something like that to give them some accountability and encouragement in the form of a grade to do that reading and to keep up with it. Because again, the more they read, the more fluent readers they're going to be. Another option is to give students time in class, say 5 or 10 minutes, to read silently to themselves. Hand out some reading materials and just give them a few minutes. And that, again, holding them accountable to get that extensive reading in each week. Another option, you could read a selection out loud to the class. If you know the students are all at or about lesson 8 in your textbook, you know what that vocabulary is, find a book or a story that's going to meet that 95 to 98% coverage and read it to them. Another option for holding them accountable is to develop comprehension quizzes for each item in your library. This provides motivation to read it and read it well, but it's also another scoreable item for grading purposes. But again, the goal is to promote language proficiency, reading fluency, through reading practice and exposure to comprehensible input. So the more the better. The more practice they get, the better they're going to be at it. Just like, shooting free throws in basketball. You keep doing it, you're going to get better at it. So in a nutshell, that's an extensive reading program and how you might develop it for your language classroom. Again, it's reading large quantities of text that are at or below the learner's current level. Again, the target being that 95 to 98% coverage, that the student understands and knows 95 to 98% of the words in that text. Now, in future episodes, I'm going to talk about some other reading strategies, reading rate practice, rereading, and then ultimately vocabulary learning, which will transition us into another unit in the podcast series, talking about how to develop good vocabulary, because that's just foundational. Word recognition skills are one of the most strongest indicators of whether a student will be able to read fluently. So I hope you can join me for these upcoming episodes, and in the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.